China cancels a bunch of wheat, but then they buy a bunch of soybeans, 25 to 30 shipments. Hold it, don't get excited. Those sales went to Brazil, not here in the U.S. Nopa Crush, the report yesterday, hit a record. And 11% of prime Midwest acres are in at least mild levels of drought. But Cavanaugh's telling me that's even more than that. Kohli and Cavanaugh standing by, made possible by some great support from the Allen County Farm Bureau. And you should appreciate the Farm Bureau as well. I mean, if you like to eat, you should probably consider a membership to support what goes on with them. Just simply go online to itpaystobeamember.org. John, David, I was kind of impressed this week with this Nopa Crush report that came out yesterday. Hit a record for the month of February and, of course, beat expectations pretty handily. John, 178 was the estimate, but the crush clocked in at a whopping 186.2 million bushels.
Wow. Yeah, that's impressive, isn't it? And, of course, again, we've been talking about all this new capacity coming on stream, and we're seeing it reflected in these monthly crush numbers. We're going to see more and more records set over the next couple of years.
David, did we see that coming?
No way, because in the last month was less than expected, and so people were crying wolf, saying, they're not going to crush it. Well, yeah, they are. They're coming back very, very hard, and we are seeing the products getting a little bit tippy right now, but at the same time, I think they're starting to find some value, and that's driving, especially with processing margins where they are, that's driving the crushers to crush as many beans as possible.
China domestic crush margins have been pretty supportive, and China booked, like I mentioned in the outset, 25 to 30 soybean shipments just this last week. Most of those shipments from Brazil, unfortunately. But wow, a lot of crushing going on, not just here in the U.S. David, this week was pretty good when it came to export sales, particularly on the corn side of things, above expectations.
Wow, that corn number was breathtaking. It came in on corn at 1.283 million. Unbelievable. Beans were only 376 with some cancellations. The low gas was 250, so we were near that. But wheat was so low, again, you can hardly count it. Only 84. Boy, oh boy, I don't know what's happened to the wheat market. Oh, yeah, I do, yeah. They're talking all about Ukraine and Russia and the Matif exchange in France, and they're trying to sell more wheat. And it seems like the more you bang the gong to try and sell wheat, the less you sell.
Well, the problem with wheat is world wheat prices have really fallen into the tank, and that's because Russia has such a large crop, and it's being harvested, and they're out there selling it aggressively, and that's driven the price of world wheat down sharply. And that's why China has canceled all these purchases from the U.S. and from Australia, because the Russian wheat has just gotten too doggone cheap, and I guess they anticipate it might even get cheaper yet. That's hurting corn prices a little bit because it's wheat and corn compete with each other. So it looks like it's going to stay cheap for a while.
And on the point about the cancellations out of China, when they're looking at what's going on with Russia and the Australian wheat crop that, finally after a couple of years of drought is actually having some fairly decent weather, right. China's looking at it going, yeah, these prices got to come down. Interesting, though, that Reuters reported this week, though, about that 1 million tons of Australian wheat was not necessarily canceled, David, but postponed, moving the shipping out to the second and third quarters of 2024.
Right.
I found that to be kind of interesting.
I think China was trying to cover themselves for their future needs. Instead of not wanting that wheat, they wanted to push it forward because they saw that might be the greater time. Plus, they can thumb their nose at the U.S. at that point. I think that was part of it, too.
China's demand for wheat has gone up rather sharply in the last 10, 12 years. I just saw a chart on that, as a matter of fact, and it was kind of interesting.
While we're talking about the three majors here, soybeans traded to their highest level since early February, running into then some farmers selling and profit taking. And it's like we had a pretty good turnaround Tuesday. And as soon as the prices came out and they were pretty good, then all of a sudden, a bunch of profit taking and prices dropped back down again.
Yeah, I think they were nervous because Allendale was supposed to have their numbers come out on their survey, and the bean acreage was only 85,832, but everybody's guessing around 87, 88. And then the corn acreage came in at 93.472. Now, they were looking for 91, but the fact is, with the higher corn acreage, farmers are going to take this warmer spring weather and plant all the corn they can before the rains hit in the last of April, early May.
David, that Allendale survey I thought was very, very interesting because the market, for the most part, has been focusing on corn acres around 91 million, and that's down from last year, I believe, was 94.6. And most people are looking for a drop down to that 90 to 91 million acre. And the Allendale survey came out at 93.4. So therefore, I think that's going to bring a lot more interest into this report on the 28th. is I'm not so sure what we're going to see. And I of course, kind of lean toward the Allendale number because they do an actual survey when they put out their estimate, which makes it a bit more realistic. And, David, we all know that farmers, especially in the western U.S., love to plant corn. We've had a very warm winter, which is anticipating a warm early spring. So I'm really focusing on that report now, more so than I was before I saw the Allendale numbers.
Well, we got to talk about what CONAB did this past week on their monthly S&D estimates. They cut Brazil's soybean production estimate by some 2.6 million metric tons to 146.85. The agency also cut total corn production to 112.75. John, we had talked about the unbelievable spread between them. I mean, USDA is still 155, 6, 7, right in that range. And boy, what a disparity. I mean, 10 million metric ton difference.
There's a huge disparity there. It's one of the greatest that I can recall seeing between what the USDA is saying and some of the commercials are saying and the private guessers. So that's got to be resolved. What's wrong with the USDA? I can't believe that many privates are out there talking numbers in mid 140s to the high 140s, and USDA is hanging around at 155. That doesn't make sense. That's got to be corrected. But the market's already part of the bean rally that we have seen in the last several days has come from the fact that these numbers keep getting lowered in Brazil, and people are believing those numbers over the USDA numbers at this point. So that's brought some buying into the soybean futures market.
Probably why that soybean number has been tickling at $12 again. But David, we got this piece from Dr. Michael Cordonnier, and he's talking about a heat dome in some areas of Brazil. And you look at the guys that have their boots on the ground, and it's really hard not to believe what they're saying.
Yeah, and this is in some of the areas that have really produced a lot of corn for the last 4 years. Mato Grosso grows 42% of the acres, Paraná 15%, and Mato Grosso do Sul 13%, and that's where the main heat's going to be located. And Rob, as you mentioned, it's 100 degrees there. Plus, and corn doesn't like pollination, anything above 95 to 100 degrees, because it tends to go up with the pollen instead of down, so you don't get a very good pollination. And I think the market's really, really going to have to look closely at the South American situation, as I've been saying. Here's an old caveat. Weather markets never last as long because you're anticipating, but realizing markets where you continue to realize new numbers and get shocked by it tend to make a market that lasts longer, and you get a better price level because of that. So if we're going to keep realizing these numbers, the market's going to have to pay attention to it at some point.
Well, one of the things we realized this past week was that those rains in Argentina were pretty severe. I mean, they had some flooding in the Buenos Aires area. What kind of impact do you see that might have on crops in Argentina?
Yeah, I think the Argentinians continue to say their crops look great. They're forecasting more rain down there, and they say it's going to help their crops because they tend to plant later than what the Brazilians do. So that's going to make Argentina look better, while Brazil continues to sink below the wave.
We're talking about Argentina being very wet, but in the U.S., they're still concerned about drought. On the weekly drought report, there's now 36% of all the corn acres are in drought areas and 33% of the soybeans, and that's up from the previous week. So we got to keep an eye on that one.
David, let's talk about livestock for a second, because the pork market was pretty crazy this week. Well, as was the beef market.
Yes. Yeah, and I know people are really looking hard at this. In fact, there's a big question in the hog market is, where are the hogs? The weekly slaughter numbers were revised down on Wednesday and Thursday. Everybody's saying the cash markets are strong for hogs and the margins are good. Where are the hogs? Why are farmers not delivering more hogs? Well, the fact is they are going through a cycle here, and they're still through it. They're going to be putting out more hogs probably by summer and then early fall. But, oh, my goodness, the cattle market. Did you see cattle market on Friday? It came up at 188 to 190. That cash market price hitting 190. Are we going to see 200 at some point?
Well, I don't know. Whatever happens, I'm going to keep on buying pork ribs at this kind of a price. I prefer them anyway. All right, this is the point where we throw it over to Cavanaugh and let him give us something that we forgot about. So with the final word, John Cavanaugh.
All right, something of interest. Scott Irwin, who is an ag economist with the University of Illinois, came out with an interesting study recently. And he compared Illinois farms' average current assets over their average current liabilities, and the current ratio is 3-to-1. Now, this is a chart that's going back to the year 2000, and this is the best ratio that we've seen during that entire time period. Now, quantifying that means the average farm in Illinois has at least $1 million of liquidity on hand to weather any downturn in agriculture. This happens to be the largest reserves in 20 years to fall back on, even larger than the reserves that the average farmer in Illinois had back in the 2006 to 2012 boom years.
So do you think those numbers are pretty accurate with regard to Indiana as well?
Absolutely. I think Illinois, frankly, is probably a little bit better off financially than Indiana. But no, Indiana is going to be very similar, as are the major farm states.
Thanks, guys. The Visit Each Week with Kohli and Cavanaugh is made possible by support from the Allen County Farm Bureau. Your local Indiana Farm Bureaus support Indiana agriculture in every way, from the classroom programs for kids to things like broadband. I'm working with the State Farm Bureau right now on ways for us to make sure that we can get better broadband access into every farm town in the state of Indiana. And when you support the Farm Bureau with a membership, you are supporting those kinds of activities, the kind that support farm families. Go online to paystobeamember.org.
Podcasts by Federated Media.